So I'm going to talk about trust today and in this slot. And why do I call it a team sport? Well, lots of people are involved in trust. Lots of entities are involved, even in digital identity. You're not just trusting one entity at any one time. To get real trust, there has to be lots of different players. So it's a sport, and you have players. But it's also a sport because there are rules that bring all of these individuals and entities and technologies together so that we can understand trust. So that's why I'd refer to it as a team sport. I'm Adam Cooper. Many people look at me as being a technologist. I'm involved in the standards world. I've been involved in the standards world for many years. I have a government background. I've been involved in writing laws about digital identity as well as technology specifications about digital identity. So I know the space in a very wide spectrum. But for me, it's not really about technology at all. It's about people. And that's what identity is really about for me. I didn't get involved in digital identity because of technology. I got involved in digital identity because at the time I was working in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. My role was looking at how we could use innovative technologies to get better outcomes for patients. This young chap here is somebody I've helped in any way I could in recent times because I still get involved in healthcare. And technology impacts this little fella's life. His name's Kai. He has a neurodeficiency syndrome called Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome, which could end his life very early if it's not dealt with. He's had 18 different specialists in 5 different countries, 11 different hospitals. Now, the data about Kai is very, very important to his well-being moving forward in life. So how we secure that data, make it accessible to him and his family so that he in later life, when he goes back to Vietnam, which is where he's from, he can actually get access to that safely and securely to help his healthcare in the future. So that's why I'm interested in this space. That's why trust is very important to individuals like Kai and getting better outcomes for people, because in his case, it may actually save his life. So that's why I want to sort of set that sort of tone really to why I'm involved in this. Now, we're at an identity conference. Controversially, I'm going to say that identity isn't enough. Identity is one small part of the equation. It's a very important part because it can tell you that I'm definitely Adam. But unless you know more about me, it's very hard to decide on things like authorization, eligibility, whether or not I should even be involved in doing certain things. And I'll try and highlight some of the reasons for that and the mechanisms as we go through. And one of the key things to understand is that trust is risk-based. It's not a black and white thing. I can't say, I definitely 100% trust you about everything, just because I know who you are, because you've signed in with a strong identity. I need to know more than that, and I need to make a decision based on what's going to happen. So there's a trustworthy fellow. He's got a passport. So I can prove who I am with a passport. I can show you my passport, you can look at it. You might even use an app or a reader to check the crypto on the chip in the document. You might look at the security features. So you can learn a lot about identity in a way from that. And it's a good example because most of us have, in this room, have almost certainly got passports, I should imagine. But far too often, it's not just this that's important. You also want to know what I want to do. So you know I'm Adam, so what am I going to do next? What's great, though, is that we've got some credentials like this in the world, and they're very strong. They're based on great standards. ICAO and others have come up with great document standards for things like passports. They are accepted internationally, so they've cracked the interoperability problem cross-border, which is great. There are laws that support them. There's lots of security in the document itself. Fantastic. But it doesn't tell me everything about Adam. It tells me one small thing. So why does trust really matter? Well, if I'm going to lend one of you my pen, the risk's really low for me. You might run off with it. I may never see it again. So unless it's a special pen that my aunt gave me and has sentimental value, I probably don't care. So knowing lots of things about you is probably not important in that case. But if I want somebody to look after my child, I don't just want to see maybe their passport and know that they're definitely Fred Smith. I probably want to know that Fred doesn't have any convictions. And I probably want to know that he's not banned from working with children. And I probably want to know that he definitely lives where he says he lives and all these kind of things so that I can have some trust in the fact that I can leave my child with that person and not worry about it. And this is really important because this is exactly the kind of process that relying parties need to go through with services in a digital world to decide whether or not they can complete transactions. It's something that banks have been doing for a long time, but it's something that digital services are having to do a lot more now. And they have to make these risk-based decisions. And there are lots of different reasons why they do that. Sometimes it's because the value of the thing you're trying to do is quite high. So they might want to make checks to make sure that you're actually supposed to be doing that. It might be that I'm a government and I want to give you a payment that's a conditional payment based on the fact that you've got children or that you've got a particular health problem, for example. So I want to check that in some other data source that's linked to you, but it's not really identity data. So there are multiple reasons why this will happen. But in the digital world, things start to split into two. When we start to share this trust information around, in the first part, we need to communicate that trust. So it needs to get from the point of issuance, perhaps, the authority that gave me that information or that knows about me, and somehow get it to the relying party service. So that's one part of the equation. The other part is understanding the actual payload itself. So where did it come from? How recently has it been checked? All those kinds of things. Is it of value enough for me to make a decision? And the communication part, from a technology point of view, we've got some great answers for. We can be very privacy preserving. We can make sure that information that we send is not tampered with in transit. We can make sure that confidentiality is preserved. All of these things we can do with current technologies and do it to a very high standard. So that's good. But that's only one part of the problem. I may have a fantastically secure privacy-preserving system, but if the data I'm passing around is untrustworthy because I can't understand the provenance of that data, did it come from an authoritative source? Was it checked within the last 12 months? All these kinds of things. How well was it attributed to me even? I may have a super high amount of trust on my authentication because I've got a really strong set of authentication credentials. But how much can you trust the data that's coming from another source about me, that it really is about me? And that's really important. And that's why we need things like metadata that describe the provenance of that data. How was it checked? So for example, with the passport authority, going back to the passport example, we know that there are processes in place for a government agency when they're checking somebody's identity to issue them with a passport. It's a very strong issuance process. Lots of checks involved, lots of laws involved. So we can be fairly certain that if it comes from a country's passport office, that we can probably trust it as an issuer. If it comes from a third party, then can we be sure that that third party is actually providing me with the correct information? So these things need to be factored in. And it will depend on the transaction, which I'll talk about a bit later, as to how much rigor you need in this equation. But without that metadata, the relying party service has very little idea of knowing whether or not it should trust the answer it's being given. So as I say, those sources of trust are very, very interesting. But in some cases, it might not matter. So if I just want your date of birth because something's age-related, that could come from a number of sources. It could come from a driving license agency, it could come from your passport, it could come from any number of different places because they all record date of birth. But if I'm going to cross a border or buy a financial product or try and access something that's really sensitive like healthcare data, you probably want to know a little bit more about me and be have a little bit more trust in who I am. So making sure that that data comes from a trustworthy source is really important. But when we're doing all of this, we need to make sure that whatever we do for things like metadata is interoperable. It's all very well if we have lots of different identity schemes and they all define the way that they transmit this information differently, and all of a sudden we've got a massive interoperability problem because guess what? We're going to have to start moving across not just silos of identity, but as many of the topics this week we'll be talking about, interoperability at a global scale. And that's really important. So we have to start thinking about standards for this kind of data, of which, to be fair, there are very few at the moment. So how can trust frameworks help with all of this? Trust frameworks set rules. Basically, they're rules for the road. It's how lots of different entities work together. And most of it is not technology. Lots of it is about business and legal rules. Much of it is about governance, and there's a bit about technical. Because technology often is the enabler of all the other things. So I work quite a lot writing laws about identity, as I said. I'm involved with the European Commission at the moment about trying to figure out how we do the next version of EIDAS, so interoperability across the 27 member states. So we're writing laws about how this works, which has very little to do with the technology bit, but means that we have to write some technology stuff to make it work, or decide what we're going to use, I should probably say. So it's the rules of the road. And standards help a lot with this. So if you went to any of the OpenID sessions today, you'll have heard lots about how OpenID enables lots of things on a global scale. Very useful. But it's not just that. W3C, DIF, NIST, all of these, ISO, all of these standards organizations are helping to make this better. Why? Because they start to give us frameworks and standards for the way we can actually do this interoperably. So they're a very important part of the technical element of those rules. But we also have to have agreements. So this cuts across some of the governance elements, because everybody needs to know what their responsibilities are. And that includes us as part of that trust framework. Why? Because increasingly we're being asked to consent for the use of our data. We're becoming part of a decentralized world as far as this is concerned. And it's very important that we understand the consequences and what's actually going on and what our responsibilities are as individuals. But we also need to make sure that all the other players understand what they're doing as well. And in some cases, get them to sign up to agreements because of that. But we also need to think about how we're protecting individuals. I mean, I said at the beginning, this is all about people. And it's very important to remember that we need to have protection for people in this as well. So what happens when things go wrong? Who do I talk to if I can't access my services anymore because something's happened to my identity? If you listened to Ian Glazer earlier talking about what was one of the most important things individuals he recruited to Salesforce when they were going through their MFA changes, it was a technical writer who could express all of this in terms that individuals who have no idea about technology and identity can understand. And it's just the same problem here. Most of the individuals who are going to be using identity have no idea how it works. And that's just reality. So being able to communicate with them and support them in a way that they can understand is massively important. So I'm just going to give a few examples of trust frameworks that are actually happening now or are starting to happen now, just to give you a feel for how this actually happens in the real world. The first one is in my home country in the UK, with the National Health Service there. One of the things we are doing is building what we call digital staff passports. So why do we need to do that? Well, we have roughly 250,000 staff moving around the organisation in any one year. We have thousands of different healthcare entities, many of them hospitals, and our staff are very fluid at the moment. They move between, they work on a shift basis, so they might be moving, we have tens of thousands of staff moving, doctors and nurses, every week between different hospitals. But when they're doing that, they're in a very trusted position, so we need to understand quite a lot about them for them to be able to practice. We need to know that they have the right to work. What does that mean? Well, it means that has there been checks done to make sure that they are not barred from working with patients because of maybe a criminal activity in the past? Are they actually allowed to be in the country? We have a lot of workers who are not UK citizens. That's just reality in a service that employs 1.5 million people. We need to understand about their skills. Why? Because the skills are not universal across the whole of the National Health Service. What's taught in one hospital can be quite different to in another, simply because of the way the settings are. And what do I mean by settings? So I mean, in a particular unit within a hospital, in some hospitals it may be purely adults. In another hospital it may be adults and children. So you need to know that the individual who's going to work for the one that doesn't have children actually has the training to work with children when they move to the other hospital. Simple things like that. So being able to pass this information around in a very trustworthy way is very important. So we're issuing staff with a digital staff passport, which is essentially a digital wallet, where they can carry these credentials that identify not just who they are, but what skills and training and checks have been done about them. So we don't have to redo it every time somebody moves. So we can move staff faster and give better outcomes to patients. This one is in the EU with digital ID wallets, which is the next version of the legislation we're working on in the UK, in the EU, sorry. I was involved in the original legislation. I'm now involved in the changes to the regulation. What the changes generally mean in this case is we're moving from somewhere which was a federated identity model, where you were basically able to use your national ID in any other country, to now where we're creating a harmonized wallet which allows you to create a new EID means that is harmonized across the whole of the EU. So it's a new EID, and it's a digital wallet, so it can hold lots of other things as well, so we can start to use it in the private sector more and enable lots of other different services. It's going to allow people to do digital signing and all kinds of things. So this is happening now, and the challenges here we have are largely political and legislative, but there's a technology angle to this as well, so we need to make sure that we're moving from something that was very much built on national EID systems, so government-based, into something that's much more akin to the private sector. And that's giving us some challenges because some of the interpretations for trust that the member states have actually conflict with the art of the possible with current smartphone handsets. And the final one is GAIN, which you possibly have heard of. A year or so ago, quite a few of us contributed to a paper that described how we might gain global interoperability across many different identity schemes. And this is a goal that many of us have because we realize that we need that global interoperability. And it's the beginnings of looking at how we can create trust frameworks that sit above trust frameworks. Oops. So 3 key takeaways for what I've just been speaking about. One is authentication is simply not enough. You need trusted data. To have any kind of meaningful transaction and to have digital transformation, that's very important. The context is always going to be crucial because trust is a risk-based decision, and every transaction will look at things differently. But we need to communicate information about the data that's being sent to us so that we can understand trust at the relying party service end. And trust frameworks help us to make sense of all of this by bringing together all of the rules so that everyone can understand what their responsibilities are and what the context is they're working within. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful. Does anyone, I think we've got a couple of minutes, does anyone have any questions? Sure. Do you want a mic?
I was going to say the context question here is probably key, and just for fun, we came up with a formula to explain it to our to our senior leaders, and it was, exactly that: your identity plus your authentication times the device you're using, equals trust. And they kind of got that. So it's like where, all I saw was really authentication and identity. What other things are you considering for context?
So context, as I'm referring to it there, is largely about the transaction and the service. So, for example, if I'm trying to access my healthcare record, that's very important to me. But it's also very sensitive data. So not only do I need to authenticate, I need to do that at quite a high level of trust. So that's the first step. But also, you probably need to do more than one thing to challenge me about what it is I'm accessing. And you probably also want to limit what data I can get hold of in the first place, because my healthcare record is, even for me, is vast, and for most of us it is. You probably don't realize quite how much data is gathered about you. And the information that I might want to see is probably only a subset of what my doctor might see. So for example, I probably won't have access to digital images of my healthcare. I won't be able to interpret them in the first place. But what I might want to do is to authorize the sharing of that data to another physician. So if I'm about to start working with a new specialist in a different hospital setting, might be private healthcare as against state healthcare, I might actually want to be part of the authorization process for that. So there are different elements to the transaction. So that's quite a complex one. It might be a very simple transaction. It might be that I just need to prove that I am a citizen of a particular country in order to get an unconditional cash payment, as we did during COVID for many countries, because that was important to get that money out quickly to people. So we actually didn't need much trust in that, other than knowing that I'm genuinely from that country. So it varies on the transaction very much. So that's what I mean by context. Did anybody else have a question? Sure.
The work you're doing.
Do you want the mic?
No. The work you're doing on the EU digital wallet.
Yeah.
So there's an authority there, which is the EU or some body there. Is the contents of that wallet, which are being put in by either the citizens or third parties, are those assumed to be trusted at that point? As a cleared house through the EU government.
So there's two elements to the wallet. One is very much the trusted data, which we are putting certain rules around about how it has to be created and what it is and where it comes from. And that's because much of that is to do with government transactions. There is a whole other aspect where we're opening it up and allowing the private sector and individuals to put other information into the wallet, so other credentials. So it could come from a private sector organization, it could come from you in particular. We're allowing both to happen. But of course, while we're doing that, this is where metadata comes in very useful, because you need to know where it's come from, how it's been checked, all these kind of things. And for the government data, that's going to be at a very high standard, and deliberately so. But other things will have happened too. So your banking data, for example, banks are well regulated, so the level of trust there is going to be probably quite high. But if it's come specifically from you, then we need to know that.
So if it's something like, say, a railway pass.
Yeah.
Or if it's a picture of a position, does the relying party then go back and validate it with the issuer, making a three-way transaction?
No, it doesn't have to, no. No, it's the trust is in the credential that's in the wallet. What we don't want to do is for every transaction you have to go back to whoever issued it. But you do want to know that there is cryptographically some proof that it was issued by a trustworthy source. Okay, I think we've probably run out of time. Thank you very much.